couple other brief topics that we need to finish up with today. First, that key concept 2.3.3 talks about various methods being employed in classical civilizations that will provide rewards, right? Provide rewards and continue production within the societies. All of these societies use some kind of system, and sometimes a combination of these systems, such as peasants paying like dues or rents to wealthy landowners, or taxes to central governments. In some cases, maybe societies don't outright conquer a neighboring society, or a civilization doesn't outright conquer another civilization. I think we saw this with the Gupta dynasty. But they might have what are called tributary states, where other civilizations or other states pay tribute to the central society, the main core society. And that tribute keeps them from being overrun and dominated. And at its most basic, peasants that might not own their own land ultimately will, might provide just service to a landowner. And that service, in a sense, pays their rent. So we've got various ways that individuals and societies, or societies themselves, might appease the wealthy class or appease the leadership class. Yes, ma'am? Yeah, you know what? I'm realizing I did not talk about Persian hierarchies. We don't know quite as much about Persian social stratification, but I wanted to throw this in there because I know Peter Stearns doesn't bring Persia up very much and doesn't talk much about Persian stratification. We know there's a king at the top. Priests have high ranking within Persian society. But they're not going to be the highest because the Persians, for most of their existence, did not force their religion on all of their subjects, right? We talked about what is one group that we know got to practice their own religion while being politically dominated by the Persians? The Jews, very good. So the priests aren't going to have the highest. What religion of the Persians? Very good, you guys are on fire. Zoroastrianism. And then down the line, it looks relatively similar to the other societies we've talked about, with people in the military. Further down, we've got traders and merchants, certainly not as low as we're going to see them as in China. Further down, peasants, and then slaves. So there are slaves within the Persian Empire, which maybe wouldn't surprise if someone said earlier, we don't see a lot of slaves in China because it's more of a homogenous culture. Persia's not. Persia runs in, it's so massive, and it runs into many different types of people as they expand. The last thing to mention today are the patriarchies that are going to develop in all of these classical societies, but they're not all identical with each other. China probably develops the most rigid patriarchal system of any of the classical civilizations, with the father being the center of the household. In fact, and this all ties back to Confucianism as well, right? But remember, here's a chicken or an egg thing, right? Confucius could have existed, or a Confucius figure could have existed in any other civilization, right? But he existed in China, and his ideas were adopted by a Chinese civilization. So what comes first? Confucius and his ideals, or the society that breeds a Confucius and his ideals? That maybe it makes my head hurt thinking about. But attaching this to Confucian ideology and Chinese civilization, Confucius said, there are no wrongdoing parents. Ooh, okay. So absolute obedience is required. And I want to bring this up. I just saw on Facebook, so yesterday there was this terrible shooting in Oregon, right? Yeah. And now these shootings are becoming, it's seemingly more and more of a common occurrence in the United States. Now I have to sometimes calm myself down a little bit, and especially calm my wife down a little bit as we hear about these things. Remember, we have a massive nation with hundreds of thousands of schools, for example. We have 330 million people living in it. We heard a couple years, there's been a couple big shootings in recent years at movie theaters. Well, there's probably tens of thousands of movie theaters in the country, and millions and millions of people going to these places every day, and most Americans have never come in contact with anything like this. Okay, so despite hearing so much more about it, it's still rare occurrence, but certainly not as rare as it is in other societies. Okay, we seem to have more of these types of issues. And I had a Facebook friend just posted something. He posted an article from Japan, where young children in Japan, because of the infrastructure and just Japanese society, young children in Japan are able to, get on trains by themselves and go from point A to point B, and it's not uncommon. And then my friend, he lived in South Korea when his wife was in the army. He lived in South Korea, and he said the same was true for South Korea. It would not be uncommon to see little kids in groups walking around in the most crowded of cities, where in America, if we see a little kid walking by himself down a street, we think, oh my gosh, and that kid must have lousy parents. Because we can't even let our kids play in a park in the United States. Not that anything would happen, but the concern that something would happen, and if you have your kid alone in a park, the police are probably going to be called, and someone's going to say, hey, there's a 9-year-old kid all by himself at this park. It's weird, because that is weird in our culture. And as a world history teacher, I kind of think about it from a little bit more of a world history perspective, and I wonder if what we're dealing with here is an East Asian society bred in Confucian ideals, so 2,000 plus years of a society that practices and preaches strict obedience to authority, which is what you see in a Confucian society. Whereas in our American society, much younger, we're only dealing with a couple hundred years, but our American society is quite the contrary, where not only are we not obedient to authority, but from our very start, from the very origins of our nation, what did we do to authority? We rebelled against it, right? We challenged authority. Quite the contrary from the Confucian ideal of filial piety and absolute obedience to our parents. American society teaches us that it doesn't matter who your parents are, that you don't have to forever be connected to your parents, and in many cases, young people do push away from their parents. Many of your goals in life is to get away from your families, right? And I don't know that one society is necessarily, or one way of living is necessarily better or worse. One certainly created a lot more of the stories like we see in Oregon, but then on the flip side, there are a lot of personal and personal freedoms that we enjoy. So you've got one society that practices strict obedience, and it has for 2 millennia, and you've got another society that embraces individualism, that embraces free thought and free thinking. And unfortunately, when some people get to be individuals and some people get to free think, we don't always like how they act, right? And that's a problem that our society certainly wrestles with. But as you kind of look around the world, start to try to think of it from a little bit of this world history perspective, and maybe we get a little bit of an understanding of how things are different. I think someone brought up the other day, I think it was you, Tyler, that just talked about the strict importance of education in the East Asian culture, how far that goes back to the idea where education was a chance to escape the poorer classes, to become maybe a member of that scholar gentry. And the same is true today in China with 1 billion plus people. Education is the one way that families see that their children can escape whatever situation that their families are in. Anyway, in China we see this absolute obedience to authority that starts with the family at home and with the father being the leader of that family. Inheritances also, when land or wealth will be passed on to the next generation, inheritances are passed on to the oldest male son. So the younger male son, you get nothing, and the girls, you get nothing. All right? So the oldest male son is going to gain inheritances. With regard to India, family life as well, just like the social hierarchy of the caste system, family life within India is going to be strictly hierarchical. Yes, ma'am?
You said that like all the males got the inheritance or whatever, but what if they had a female only child?
If it was a female-only child or family, that probably would have been quite rare. You know, the notions of just having one child, that is a very modern thing. That I would guess that would probably be rarer. And I don't know. I would only be speculating as to where the wealth would be passed on to, but I guess it would be passed on to her. But I'm speculating. I don't really know. Yes?
Oh, sorry. In Eastern, Southeastern and Asian culture, we have this thing called, for the oldest son, we call them first order son.
Okay.
And for grandson, we have something called the first order grandson, the oldest grandson. So if there are the two daughters, for example, they have two daughters with no males.
Yeah.
The inheritance will be passed on to the first order grandson.
Oh, wow.
The son.
So it'll skip the daughters.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
And they call it the maternal first order grandson because it's from a girl, but most of the line is found by the first order grandson. Like the authentic one is the son of the oldest son of the oldest son.
Okay.
So, for example, if you have a son,
Yeah.
and that's the oldest son, and that son also has a son.
Okay.
So that son will inherit whatever the most. So it's very good if you're oldest.
Gotcha.
And you are a boy. So
Okay.
in those cultures, it doesn't matter if you're a boy. It doesn't matter if you're a girl, even though you're older.
Well, and here we go back to the Confucian relationships, right? We had father to son, husband to wife, elder brother to younger brother, right? And I think that all ties in. Thank you so much for sharing that. Back to India, still that strict hierarchy with husbands dominant, and women's rights in India are going to be severely limited compared to that of the husband. But it's not quite China in that, you know, in Hindu culture or in the Hindu faith, you're going to have some female goddesses, and you're going to have a lot of stories in the ancient texts that highlight women and emphasize female traits and such. So there's going to be a nod that women are important in the whole order of things. But certainly in the household and in the political society, women don't have a voice. Marriages, I mentioned as well, are arranged. You know, the young girl, she is going to essentially be sold off by her parents to whomever might be the highest bidder or whatever is the best economic deal. The Mediterranean region as well. We're going to have again tight family structures. And when I talk about this tight family structure, I guess the best way to do it is to contrast it with today, like a Western American culture, where today is not uncommon for divorces to take place, or to have blended families, or single-parent families. We would not call that a tight family structure, okay? I'm not making a judgment call here or anything, but in these more classical civilizations, the husband and the wife and the children, they were like stuck together. And in fact, in most of these societies, except for some Mediterranean societies, in most of these societies, a woman could not legally divorce her husband. A husband might be able to divorce his wife, but a woman was stuck with her husband. Except, actually, we're gonna hear about here in Rome when that could sometimes happen. Women in the Roman Empire could have some important economic functions, especially higher-ranking women, aristocratic women. So upper-class women in Rome might have more influence within the household or even within society at large. And again, it's still a patriarchal system, but we must remember that in the Mediterranean world, there is great diversity between the different areas and different city-states, for example, in the Greek world, and how their women are treated. A famous quote from a writer named Plutarch, you just hear it, don't write it, when speaking this queen of Sparta named Gorgo, if you've seen the movie 300, Gorgo is Leonidas' wife, so the king's wife. This queen Gorgo was asked, why are you Spartan women the only ones who can rule men? Because of the higher ranking that these Spartan women seem to have in their households. Why are you Spartan women the only ones that can rule men? And then she says back, and I think one of the most awesome lines ever, because we are the only ones who give birth to men. Ooh. So what does Gorgo, the Spartan, think of Athenian women and Athenian men? that they're not real men, right? Only real women can rule because only real women give birth to real men, and there are no other real men outside of Sparta.